The ropes didn't just cut her skin. They were cutting her out of the world. Eliza hung from the post in the center of town, a spectacle for the righteous and the cruel. Her arms, stretched until the muscles screamed, were tied to the crossbeam. Her hands were numb, purple lumps at the end of her wrists. The sun wasn't just hot. It was an anvil, beating down on her, trying to hammer her into the dust. Every person she'd ever known was there. The women she'd shared tea with, their faces were now masks of disgust. The blacksmith who'd always tipped his hat, he now stared right through her. Their judgment was a physical thing, a weight heavier than the chains they could have used. Thief. The word came from the crowd, sharp as a shard of glass. Shame. Another voice, colder this time. Let her rot. She tried to shake her head, to say the words again. I did nothing, but her throat was a desert, her voice a dry rasp that the wind snatched away. A boy, one she'd given a sweet to just last week, picked up a stone. His aim was true. It struck her shoulder, and a low murmur of approval rippled through the onlookers. Her knees gave way, but the ropes held her up, turning her agony into a public performance. This wasn't justice. This was a warning. This is what happens when you step out of line in a town that has its own rules. The world shimmered in the heat, a blurry nightmare she couldn't wake from, and through the haze, a memory pushed its way through the pain. Luke, the elder's son. His face in the barn, too close. His hand reaching for her, his breath smelling of sour whiskey. Her turning away, the sharp sting of his pride, and his parting words hissed like a snake in the straw. You'll be sorry you did that, Eliza. Everyone in this town will know what you are. 2 days later, the elders' prize cattle were gone, and the whispers started. They coiled around her, tightening their grip until the whole town was convinced. Eliza the thief. She pressed her cheek against the rough wood of the post, the splinters digging into her skin. The lie was a living thing, and right now it was choking the life out of her. The sun climbed higher, the shadows grew shorter, and her time was running out. Then, a shape appeared at the edge of the crowd. A man on a horse, moving slow, deliberate. He wasn't part of the town's frenzy. He was something else. The crowd parted for him, not out of respect, but out of a nervous curiosity. He stopped his horse right in front of her. He was an older man, his face a map of roads traveled and hardships endured. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at her. For the first time all day, someone looked at her and saw a person, not a criminal. He swung down from his horse, and he started walking toward the post. One of the townsmen stepped forward. That's far enough, stranger. This is town business. The man didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. He just kept walking, his eyes fixed on the ropes that held Eliza captive. A low growl started in the crowd. They were a mob, and a mob doesn't like being challenged. But the stranger acted like he couldn't hear them. He reached the post, pulled a knife from his belt, and without a single word he began to cut the ropes. The silence that fell over the town square was deafening. It was the silence before the storm. Just as the first rope snapped, a voice cut through the air, sharp and arrogant. "Step away from her." The stranger paused, the knife still in his hand. He turned slowly. Luke, the elder's son, swaggered forward, a thick-shouldered farmhand at his side. The farmhand was gripping a heavy wooden club, his knuckles white. Luke had a smirk on his face, the kind of smirk that made you want to wipe it off with a fist. "This doesn't concern you, old man." The stranger didn't answer. He just stood there, a quiet mountain between Luke and Eliza. His silence was louder than any threat. It spoke of lines being drawn, of choices being made. Luke's smirk faltered for just a second. He wasn't used to being ignored. "I said," Luke repeated, his voice rising, "she stays where she is." The stranger finally spoke. His voice was low, but it carried like thunder. "You've had your fun, boy." He turned back to Eliza, raising his knife to the second rope. "Now she's coming down." That's when Eliza found what was left of her voice. It came out as a ragged cry full of pain and fury. "He's the liar!" she screamed, her eyes locking onto Luke. "He tried to force himself on me. I said no, and he did this to me. He stole the cattle to punish me." The accusation hung in the scorching air. Every eye turned to Luke, and for a heartbeat Jacob saw it, a flicker of panic in the young man's eyes. The truth had a way of doing that. The farmhand didn't wait for an order. He lunged, swinging the club in a wide, clumsy arc aimed at the stranger's head. The stranger moved with a speed that defied his age. He sidestepped the blow, the club whistling past his ear. He grabbed the farmhand's arm, twisted, and used the man's own momentum to send him sprawling into the dust. The big man landed with a grunt, the wind knocked out of him. Luke, seeing his muscle taken out so easily, let out a snarl and charged, pulling a knife of his own. The blade glittered in the sun, a wicked sliver of steel. He slashed wildly, aiming for the stranger's gut, but the stranger was faster. He deflected the blow with his forearm, the blade slicing through his sleeve but missing his skin. He grabbed Luke's wrist, squeezed hard, and a crack echoed in the silence. Luke cried out, his knife clattering to the ground. The stranger didn't let go. He spun, pulling Luke off balance, and delivered a single, precise punch to the jaw. Luke crumpled to his knees, spitting blood and a tooth into the dirt. His pride, the thing he valued most, was shattered in front of the whole town. The stranger stood over him, chest heaving slightly, not with rage, but with a cold, focused calm. He turned and sliced through the final ropes holding Eliza. She collapsed, her legs unable to hold her, and he caught her before she hit the ground. She sagged against him, tears of relief and pain streaking through the grime on her face. Luke staggered to his feet, one hand holding his broken jaw, his eyes burning with a venomous hatred. He was beaten, but he wasn't broken. Not yet. Eliza's voice was a whisper, but it was as sharp as the knife still lying in the dust. "His knife," she said, her eyes fixed on the fallen blade. "Jacob, tell them about his knife. They have to see the truth." The stranger, Jacob, looked down. The knife lay half buried in the dirt, the sun glinting off something carved into the wooden handle. His eyes narrowed. What he did next would either save Eliza or condemn them both. Jacob bent down, his joints creaking like old leather, and picked up the knife. He didn't wipe the dust off. He held it up for the silent crowd to see. Carved deep into the worn wooden handle was a single, unmistakable letter, L. It was Luke's knife. Everyone knew it. He flashed it around town like a badge of honor, a symbol of his family's power. "I saw him drop it," Eliza said, her voice gaining strength with every word. "By the cattle fence, the night they went missing." She stared directly at Luke, and for the first time there was no fear in her eyes, only fire. Luke's face twisted into a sneer, though it was less convincing with his swollen jaw. "That proves nothing," he spat, blood flecking his lips. "She could have planted it." But the words rang hollow. The townspeople were looking at him differently now. The seed of doubt had been planted. Jacob took a step toward him, his shadow falling over the younger man. "You framed her, Luke," Jacob said, his voice flat and hard. "You couldn't take no for an answer, so you decided to destroy her." Luke backed away, his eyes darting around, looking for support. But the faces in the crowd were no longer on his side. They were watching, waiting. The farmhand was still on the ground, groaning, useless. Luke was alone. "This knife," Jacob continued, his voice resonating with authority, "is all the proof Sheriff Collins will need." The mention of the sheriff sent a new jolt of fear through Luke. "You'll regret this, old man," he snarled. "You don't know who you're messing with." Jacob didn't even blink. "I've regretted a lot of things in my life, boy." Standing up for what's right won't be one of them. Luke spat on the ground, a final pathetic act of defiance. The sheriff listens to my father, not to some drifter and a common thief. A small, grim smile touched Jacob's lips. You let me worry about the sheriff. He and I go way back before your daddy owned half this county. The threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Luke stared at the knife in Jacob's hand, then at the hard faces of the townspeople. His power was slipping through his fingers like sand. With one last hateful glare, he turned and stormed away, his farmhand scrambling to his feet and limping after him. The tension broke. The crowd began to murmur, the whispers now tinged with shame and uncertainty. They had been so quick to judge, so eager to condemn. Jacob tucked Luke's knife securely into his belt. He turned to Eliza, his expression softening. He gently helped her onto his horse, his hands surprisingly steady. Hold on tight, he said, swinging up behind her. We're going to see the sheriff. Let's find out how brave that boy is when he's not hiding behind a mob. The horse moved forward, its hooves kicking up small puffs of dust, carrying two unlikely allies toward a reckoning. The town square they left behind was filled with people who had a lot to think about, and as they rode, you have to wonder, what makes one person stand up when everyone else stays silent? If you've ever asked yourself that question, you'll want to stick around for what happens next, because this story is far from over. Getting to the sheriff is one thing. Getting him to stand up to the most powerful man in town, that's a whole different fight. The ride into town was a blur of pain for Eliza. Every step the horse took sent a jolt through her bruised body. She leaned back against Jacob, drawing strength from his quiet solidity. The town itself seemed to hold its breath as they passed. Doors closed, curtains twitched. No one wanted to be seen choosing a side. Not yet. The sheriff's office was a small, dusty building that smelled of stale coffee and sawdust. Sheriff Collins was a man worn down by the job. He had a tired face and eyes that had seen too much trouble. He looked up from his paperwork as they entered, and his jaw dropped. Eliza? Good Lord, what in blazes happened to you? Jacob eased her into the only chair in the room. The town happened to her, Collins. Or more specifically, Luke happened to her. He laid out the story, short and sharp, ending by placing the knife on the sheriff's desk. The carved L seemed to glow in the dim light. Collins picked it up, turning it over in his calloused hands. He didn't look surprised to see it. He just looked weary. He glanced from the knife to Eliza's raw wrists. Luke's a hothead, he said, his voice a low rumble. Always has been. Eliza forced herself to speak, her voice raspy. He lied. He framed me. Collins sighed, a long, heavy sound. He leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning in protest. I believe you, Eliza. The thing is, believing you and doing something about it are two very different things in this town. He gestured vaguely toward the window. You know who his father is. Judge Abernathy basically runs this county. He's the law, the bank, and the church all rolled into one. Jacob's jaw tightened. So you're just going to let it go? You're going to let that boy get away with nearly killing an innocent woman? I didn't say that, Collins snapped, his frustration showing. I'm saying you've brought me a knife and a story. Abernathy will bring me a dozen paid witnesses who'll swear they saw Eliza leading those cattle away herself. Who do you think this town will believe? A cold dread settled in Eliza's stomach. He was right. It was her word against the word of the most powerful family for 100 miles. Justice wasn't about truth. It was about power. So that's it, she whispered, the last of her hope draining away. He wins? Sheriff Collins stared at the knife on his desk. He looked at Eliza's tear-streaked face. He looked at Jacob's unyielding gaze. He seemed to be weighing the cost of action against the cost of inaction. No, he said finally, his voice barely audible. That's not it. He stood up and walked to a locked cabinet in the corner of the room. He fumbled with a ring of keys, selected one, and opened the door. He reached inside and pulled out a dusty ledger. He brought it back to the desk and opened it. Flipping through pages filled with spidery handwriting, he stopped at a page near the middle. "Abernathy's power comes from money," Collins said, tracing a line of text with his finger. "And secrets. A year ago, a shipment of gold was stolen from a stagecoach just north of here. The guards were killed. The gold was never found. The case went cold." Jacob frowned. "What's that got to do with this?" The sheriff looked up, and for the first time there was a spark in his tired eyes. "The Abernathy ranch suddenly got a whole lot bigger right after that robbery. New fences, new barn, prize-winning bull bought from back east. Abernathy said it was an inheritance. I was always suspicious." He tapped the ledger. "The description of one of the bandits. It mentioned a distinctive knife. One with a letter carved into the handle." The air in the room went still. Eliza stared at the knife on the desk. It wasn't just a tool of a spoiled bully. It was the key to a murder. And Luke had just brought it out in the open for everyone to see. Jacob stared at the sheriff, the pieces clicking into place. This wasn't just about stolen cattle anymore. It was about something much older, much darker. "You think Luke was involved in that robbery?" Collins shook his head. "Luke was too young, too foolish. But his father's farmhand, the one who was with him today, he fits the description of the second bandit perfectly, and he's been loyal to Abernathy for a long, long time." The game had just changed. They didn't have to prove Luke framed Eliza. They had to connect this knife to a crime so serious that even Judge Abernathy couldn't sweep it under the rug. "The problem," Collins continued, closing the ledger, "is that the only surviving witness from that robbery, a passenger, fled town right after. He was terrified. Said Abernathy's men were looking for him. I never saw him again." Eliza felt a familiar wave of despair. A witness who was long gone. It was another dead end. But Jacob's eyes had a strange light in them. He looked at Eliza, then back at the sheriff. "What did this witness look like?" Collins described him. A small man, a tailor by trade, with a noticeable limp from an old war injury. Jacob stood perfectly still for a long moment. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken possibilities. Eliza watched him, her heart pounding. She could see the gears turning behind his weathered face. Finally he spoke, his voice low and steady. "I know where he is." The sheriff's head snapped up. "What? How could you possibly—" "He runs a small shop 2 towns over," Jacob said, his voice certain. "Calls himself Martin now. I buy my supplies from him. He's a good man, a scared man, but a good man." Suddenly there was a path. A dangerous, narrow path, but a path nonetheless. If they could get this witness, Martin, to come back and testify. If they could get him to identify the farmhand and the knife, they could bring down the entire Abernathy empire. "Abernathy will have eyes everywhere," Collins warned. "If he gets wind that you're going after that witness, he'll send men to silence both of you for good." "He has to get wind of it first," Jacob said, his hand resting on the hilt of his own pistol. He looked at Eliza. Her ordeal had started this, had dragged this dark secret into the light. Now, she was at the center of it. "I'm going with you," she said, her voice firm. There was no trace of the broken woman who had hung from the post. In her place was someone forged in fire, someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Collins nodded slowly, a grim respect in his eyes. "All right. I'll hold Luke here on a trumped-up charge, drunk and disorderly. It'll only buy you a day, maybe 2, before his father comes storming in here. You need to be back with that witness before Abernathy tears this town apart to find his son." The stakes had been raised to a terrifying new level. It was a race against time, with killers lurking in the shadows and the fate of the entire county hanging in the balance. Jacob and Eliza walked out of the sheriff's office and into the fading light, the road ahead uncertain and fraught with peril. Their journey was just beginning, and if you think you know how this ends, you'd better hold on tight, because when powerful men have secrets to protect, they don't just fight. They burn the world down around them, and Jacob and Eliza are about to ride straight into the heart of the fire. The town of Redemption was a 2-day ride, and they pushed their horses hard, avoiding the main roads. Jacob knew the land, the hidden trails that cut through the rocky hills, places where Abernathy's men would be less likely to look. They spoke little, the silence between them filled with a shared purpose. Eliza found a strength she never knew she possessed. The pain from her wrists was a dull ache now, a reminder of what she was fighting against. They arrived in Redemption as dusk was painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was a smaller town, quieter than their own, a place where a man could disappear if he wanted to. Martin's tailor shop was a modest storefront at the end of the main street. A dim light glowed from within. "You wait here," Jacob said, swinging down from his horse. "Let me talk to him first. He's a jumpy fellow." Eliza watched as Jacob approached the shop, his silhouette tall and steady against the twilight. He knocked on the door. After a long moment, it opened a crack. She could hear muffled voices, one low and calm, the other high and nervous. The door opened wider, and Jacob disappeared inside. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every passing horseman could be one of Abernathy's riders. Finally, the door opened again. Jacob emerged, and behind him was a small, stoop-shouldered man with a pronounced limp. Martin. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a fear that looked a year old. Jacob led him over to where Eliza waited. "Martin," Jacob said gently, "this is Eliza. She's the one they tried to silence." Martin looked at Eliza's bruised face and raw wrists, and something in his expression shifted from fear to a pained empathy. He had seen what these men were capable of. "They said they'd kill my family," Martin whispered, his voice trembling. "They knew where my sister lived. They described her children to me." "They'll keep doing it, Martin," Eliza said, her voice finding a new power. "They'll keep hurting people, ruining lives, until someone stands up and says no more. They did this to me over a petty grudge. Imagine what they'd do to keep a murder covered up." The tailor looked from Eliza's determined face to Jacob's steady one. He was a man caught between two terrors, the memory of Abernathy's threats and the reality of the evil they represented. "Even if I testify," he stammered, "it's my word against theirs. Abernathy owns the judge." "He is the judge," Jacob corrected him grimly, "which is why we're not going to the court. We're going to the people. Collins is going to call a town council meeting. You'll tell your story in front of everyone. Let's see Abernathy try to silence an entire town." It was a wild gamble, a desperate play, but it was the only one they had. Martin looked at the ground, his body trembling. He was wrestling with a choice that could get him killed. Suddenly, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the far end of the street. Fast hoofbeats. More than one rider. "They found us," Martin gasped, his face draining of all color. Jacob's hand was already on his gun. "Get inside," he ordered Martin. "Eliza, get down." Two riders thundered into the street, their faces obscured by the growing darkness. They weren't Abernathy's men. They were wearing the badges of U.S. Marshals. They reined in their horses, kicking up dust just feet from Jacob. The lead marshal, a man with a scarred face and cold eyes, looked down at Jacob. "You Jacob Kane?" Jacob nodded slowly, his hand never leaving his pistol. "I am." The marshal held up a rolled-up piece of paper. "I have a warrant for your arrest." Eliza's heart stopped. A warrant? For what? "On what charge?" Jacob asked, his voice dangerously calm. The marshal's lips curled into a cruel smile. for the murder of 2 guards during a stagecoach robbery 1 year ago. The world tilted on its axis. Abernathy was more cunning than they had ever imagined. He hadn't just sent thugs, he had twisted the law itself into a weapon. He was framing Jacob for the very crime they were trying to expose. And with the only man who could protect them now a wanted fugitive, Eliza and Martin were left completely, terrifyingly alone. The marshal's words hung in the air, a death sentence delivered in the dusty street. Eliza scrambled to her feet. "That's a lie! Abernathy is framing him!" The scarred marshal just laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Tell it to the hangman, ma'am." He and his partner dismounted, their movements confident and practiced. They were here to do a job. Jacob didn't move. He didn't draw his weapon. He just stood there, his eyes locked on the marshal. "You're not real marshals," he said, his voice flat. The man's smile vanished. "What did you say?" "I said," Jacob repeated, "that you're wearing brand new badges on dusty clothes. You're paid men, Abernathy's men." The scarred man's eyes narrowed. He'd been caught, and he didn't like it. Smart old man. Too smart for your own good. In a blur of motion, he drew his pistol. He never got a shot off. Jacob's gun was already in his hand. A single shot cracked through the night, deafeningly loud. The fake marshal staggered back, a look of pure shock on his face, a dark hole appearing in his chest. He collapsed in a heap, his gun firing harmlessly into the wooden boardwalk. The second man, younger and less experienced, fumbled for his own weapon, his eyes wide with panic. Jacob didn't give him the chance. He spun and fired again. The second man grunted and fell against his horse, sliding to the ground. Silence descended on the street, broken only by the nervous whinnying of the horses. Martin was huddled in the doorway of his shop, shaking uncontrollably. Jacob stood over the 2 bodies, smoke curling from the barrel of his pistol. He was no longer just a quiet drifter. He was a man who had just killed 2 people, even if they were sent to kill him. The law wouldn't care about the details. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent. "Now." Their real target was Martin. They were just trying to get me out of the way. They had to get back to their town, back to Sheriff Collins. But now they weren't just racing against time. They were fugitives, with the blood of 2 men on their hands. Abernathy had turned the tables completely. Jacob hadn't just been accused of an old murder. He'd just committed a new one in front of 2 witnesses. They rode through the night, pushing the horses to their limit. Every sound, every shadow was a potential threat. Martin rode with them, his terror now solidified into a grim resolve. He had seen the lengths Abernathy would go to. There was no running anymore. They reached their town just as the first rays of dawn were breaking. They didn't go down the main street. Jacob led them through the back alleys, stopping behind the sheriff's office. He left Eliza and Martin with the horses. "Stay here. Don't move." He slipped through the back door of the office. A few minutes later, he emerged with Sheriff Collins, whose face was a mask of grim urgency. "It's worse than we thought," Collins said, not wasting time with greetings. "Abernathy came for Luke last night. He brought a circuit judge with him, got Luke released, and then he put out a bounty on your head, Jacob, $500, wanted for murder. Every bounty hunter and gunman in the territory is going to be heading this way." They were trapped. The town was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage, and the hunters were coming. "The council meeting," Eliza said, her voice desperate. "It's our only chance." Collins nodded. "I've called it for noon, in the town square, right out in the open." He looked at Jacob. "But Abernathy will be there, and he'll have his men. He's not going to let Martin say a single word." The final confrontation was set. It wouldn't be in a courtroom. It would be in the very spot where Eliza had been tied and shamed. Noon. The whole town as witness. It was a desperate, suicidal plan, and the clock was ticking. If you've been on the edge of your seat, you need to see this through to the end. The final chapter is about to unfold. Will the truth be enough to stop a man who has all the power, Or will justice be buried once and for all in the dusty streets of a town on the brink of war? Hit that subscribe button because you don't want to miss a single second of what comes next. The town square was packed. It felt like every man, woman, and child for 50 miles had come to see the final act of this drama. They stood in silence, a nervous energy crackling in the air. On one side of the square stood Judge Abernathy, flanked by a dozen hard-faced men, his farmhand among them. Abernathy looked calm, powerful, completely in control. On the other side stood Sheriff Collins, with Jacob, Eliza, and the trembling Taylor, Martin, beside him. They looked impossibly outnumbered. The clock on the church tower began to chime for noon. Each bell toll was like a hammer blow. When the last chime faded, Abernathy stepped forward. "Sheriff," he began, his voice booming across the square, "I'm not sure why you've called this ridiculous gathering, but I am here to see justice done. I'm here to see this murderer," he pointed a finger at Jacob, "brought to justice for killing 2 lawmen." "They weren't lawmen," Collins called back, his voice steady. "They were hired guns wearing stolen badges. And we're all here to find out why you sent them." Abernathy laughed. "An absurd accusation. This man is a known criminal, wanted for a stagecoach robbery a year ago. He is trying to deflect his own guilt by spinning wild tales. He had a story for everything. He was twisting the truth so fast it was impossible to get a grip on it." "Then let's hear another story," Collins said. "A story from a man who was on that stagecoach. A man you thought you'd silenced for good." He gestured to Martin. Martin stepped forward, his limp more pronounced under the weight of 100 stares. He was terrified, but he looked at Eliza, and he found his courage. He pointed a shaking finger at Abernathy's farmhand. "That man," he said, his voice cracking but clear. "He was one of them. He killed the driver and the man who led them. He dropped his knife. I saw it." Martin looked at Abernathy. "It was your knife, the one with the L on it, for Luke." A gasp went through the crowd. It wasn't Luke's knife. It was his father's. The initial L wasn't for Luke. It was for his father, whose first name was Lawrence. Abernathy's face went rigid. "This is nonsense. A desperate lie from a wanted man and his pet Taylor." "Is it?" Jacob's voice cut in. He stepped forward, holding up the knife. "I found this by the cattle fence. You didn't just frame Eliza. You used your son's petty cruelty to try and get rid of the one piece of evidence that could tie you to that robbery. You let your own son take the blame for your knife, knowing you could get him out of any trouble. But you never expected it to lead back to you." The puzzle was complete. The crowd murmured, the pieces clicking into place for them, too. They saw the arrogance of the judge, the fear on the farmhand's face. They saw the truth. Abernathy knew he was losing. His eyes went cold. "I am the law here," he snarled. He gave a sharp nod to his men. "Arrest them all." His hired guns reached for their pistols. The crowd panicked, screaming and scrambling to get away, but Sheriff Collins had been waiting for this. "Now!" he yelled. From the rooftops around the square, a dozen men rose up, rifles in their hands. They were simple townsfolk, the blacksmith, the butcher, the farmers, men who had stood by and watched Eliza's humiliation. But today, they had chosen a side. They had their rifles trained on Abernathy's men. Abernathy's gunslingers froze, their hands hovering over their weapons. They were caught. The judge stared in disbelief. His power, his control, had vanished in an instant. The people he had ruled through fear had finally found their courage. The farmhand, seeing the tables turn, made a run for it. But Jacob was faster. He tackled the man, bringing him down in the dirt. It was over. Judge Abernathy stood alone in the center of the square, his empire crumbling around him. The townspeople closed in, their faces no longer fearful but filled with a cold, righteous anger. The law had failed them, so they had become the law. As the dust settled, Eliza walked over to Jacob. The sun was on her face, but this time it felt warm, like a new beginning. "You saved me," she said, her voice filled with a quiet awe. He looked at the faces in the crowd, the people who had finally stood up. He tipped his hat. "Maybe we all saved each other today." This story reminds us that the worst lies are the ones we tell ourselves, that we are helpless, that we are alone, that one person cannot make a difference. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's standing up, even when you're afraid, and speaking the truth in a world full of lies. And sometimes the deepest love is forged not in peace, but in the shared fight for what is right. It's born when two people, pushed to the edge, decide to stand together and push back. If this story of redemption and courage struck a chord with you, do us a favor and hit that like button. And if you want to be here for our next journey into the heart of the Old West, make sure you subscribe to the channel. There are countless more tales buried out there in the dust, and each one has a lesson waiting to be found. Thanks for riding with us.